Hi, and welcome back to Instavision. I'm Glenn Reynolds. Well, everyone knows we're in a higher education bubble. You could write a book on that. But not all education is created equal. My guest is Bloomberg columnist Virginia Postrel. She's the author of The Future and Its Enemies, The Substance of Style, and the Power of Glamour, and she's actually written a lot on this. Welcome, Virginia.
Great to be here.
So, a while back, Barack Obama got himself into hot water by dissing art history majors as impractical.
A lot of young people no longer see the trades and skilled manufacturing as a viable career, but I promise you, folks can make a lot more potentially with skilled manufacturing or the trades than they might with an art history degree. Now, nothing wrong with an art history degree. I love art history. So I don't want to get a bunch of emails from everybody. I'm just saying you can make a really good living and have a great career without getting a four-year college education as long as you get the skills and the training that you need.
Now, he's not really wrong about the importance of trades or other ways to make money, but you criticized him pretty hard for this, and you weren't the only one. Why was he wrong to diss art history and the liberal arts?
Right. Well, there's a couple of reasons. First of all, right, the scripted comments, the point he was supposed to be making was perfectly okay. Yes, it's great to get a trade. You don't have to have a four-year college education necessarily to have a good job, certainly not to have an important job. That's all fine. But people have this idea that the higher education bubble or people with big loans or, is full. It's because of all these silly liberal arts majors studying things like art history. And art history is the go-to example. Okay, there are a bunch of things wrong with that. The first one is essentially no one majors in art history. Less than 0.2% of college students major in art history. And art history is actually a really rigorous, hard major most places. You have to memorize and really know a tremendous number of visual images. Often you have to know foreign languages. You have to develop writing skills. It's a very rigorous major, and hardly anybody studies it. So why are we picking on art history? That's one problem. And if you even broaden it out to the humanities, not that many people are actually majoring in the humanities, about 12% of college students. More than half of college students are majoring either in business, which is that's by far the largest major, the various STEM fields that we keep being told are what everyone should major in is like 17%, or economics. And where people are sort of wasting their money, if possibly in college, is when they take majors that sound like they might be professional or useful, but are actually not sufficiently rigorous. Things like communication. Communication is a perfectly valid, important thing to study. Look, here we are on communicating on video. But in many schools, it's not a very rigorous major. It's sort of a party major. So that's really the issue. There's no reason to pick on art history, of all things.
Yeah, I've written, of course, a lot about the higher education bubble, and people often take that as an endorsement of practical things. For example, say studying engineering as opposed to the liberal arts. But I don't think that's quite right. I mean, a liberal arts degree can be quite rigorous if it's a good one, and there's nothing that's not practical about knowing how to think and read and write and talk. Am I right?
You're absolutely right. And conversely, we think things are practical and we forget how the economy actually works. And there are two great lessons, and these are lessons that are in the key to The Future and Its Enemies, where the context was completely different. One is that people are different. Different skills, there is no one best way. And people who want to centrally plan things always think there's one thing for everybody. And that's no more true in education than it is in anything else. And the other is that the economy is always changing. So when I wrote about this in detail for Bloomberg View a couple of years ago, this is before Obama's comments, I pointed out that when I was in college, I was lucky. When you and I don't know if you were aware of this, but when we went to college, all the best studies showed that a college education did not pay off economically because those studies are always backward looking.
Right.
And we went to college right at the moment that was changing. But when I went to college, I just went to college to get an education, to broaden my mind, to learn to think. I didn't think about vocations. I thought of vocations outside the classroom. And when I graduated from college, I had two great professional skills. One, which is what I did coming out of college, is I was a journalist. I got a job in the worst recession since the Great Depression. I got a job as a journalist. But I knew that if I couldn't do that, I had a great skill to fall back on because I was a fabulous typist. And I could always get a job with my practical typing skills, even though you're not supposed to go to Princeton and become a secretary. And of course now, nobody hires typists, and journalists are, not far behind. The economy changes. When I came out of college, all the people who had been chemical engineering majors and thought they were going to, have limos waiting for them, they could barely get jobs. They were using their programming skills to get jobs.
When I was in college, that's right. That was the hot major when I was like a freshman or a sophomore, chemical engineering, and everybody's talking about the huge starting salaries. And literally by the time I graduated, the oil market had tanked, and they weren't hiring chemical engineers, and those very same people who've been boasting about their job prospects were looking for other work.
Right, exactly. I mean, I had friends who were chemical engineering majors who had taken they had learned programming, Fortran, useful skill. I should have taken that, right? They had learned programming, and they got jobs. Their first jobs out of college were maybe in computer programming rather than chemical engineering.
So if a major that doesn't sort of map to an obvious job isn't the way to go, what kind of things should students look to get out of their education?
Well, I think students should, first of all, think about what they like. And I'm not one of those people who goes, oh, pursue your passions and all will be well, because that's not necessarily true, but it is important. There are certain fields like accounting where it's always practical. Become an actuary. It's always practical. But most people aren't really cut out for that. They don't have the right personalities or skills. So you have to match your personality to what you're doing. And then the other thing is to don't expect to party for 4 years. I mean, party some, but actually you're in school to learn stuff. And that's an important aspect of it. And that often gets left behind in these discussions, that the problem for many students is that they are not really going to college for an education. They're going to college for a social experience, and that's fine if they and their parents realize that that's what they're buying for all that money. But if it's not, you might want to actually pay attention in class.
Yeah, because it's a pretty expensive social experience. I mean, you might be better off getting a job as a counselor at Club Med for a while or something, where they at least sort of pay you, because college is 4 years, and we say 4 years, but actually the majority of students don't graduate in 4 years. And the planners at universities now assume that the average student will take 6 years to graduate. So a 6-year investment of money and years of your life, and you don't have an endless number of years in your 20s. When they're gone, they're gone. And if you spend them in college partying, they're not there for other stuff. That's a big investment, and maybe partying isn't the place to invest the time and the money.
And there's an important book by a couple of sociologists called "Paying for the Party," and it's a sort of in-depth ethnographic study of essentially it's Indiana University, a party dorm at Indiana University, and what they find is that it's all women in this study, but for some of these sorority girls, which is who we're dealing with, it works out fine because their parents are well connected and get them jobs at the end, and sometimes their parents also keep them on track. But for somebody who's first generation college education, or maybe their parents have less sort of social capital, less background, they can get really off track and then end up with jobs that are less than, or that they could have gotten with a high school education.
But with college debt.
But with college debt. And also with, I think the point about the 4 years of your life is an important one, because even if it's a state school and even if you get financial aid and all of that, there's still what economists call opportunity costs, which is what you could have been doing otherwise. Yeah,
4 years of your life, you only have a certain number of chunks, 4-year chunks of your life, and as you get older, you realize it's not infinite.
But I do think I'm this born contrarian. I used to write I use my middle initial. I used to write Virginia I Postrel, and my husband used to call me Virginia I beg to differ Postrel, and I do think it's important that we remind people that there are no guarantees. If you major in engineering, it does not guarantee that for the next 45 years you will be having a well-paid career and everything will be secure. Even accountants don't have that much security.
Yeah, that's actually one thing I tell people too, is you do the math on this stuff, and when you look at the expected value, you have to factor in the possibility that you're going to borrow this money and you won't get that job that you think will pay the loans back, or you'll get it and you hate it, in which case either you quit it or you stay in a job you hate, which is bad. One of the things you want to do actually going to college is not tie up too much capital in whatever you plan to do, because say for example, in my world of legal education, the only jobs that really pay enough to cover really high levels of expensive student loans are Wall Street jobs. So you make $170,000 to start, which will cover student loans for an expensive law school. But the reason those jobs pay that much is because they're awful.
Yeah.
They're terrible.
Yeah.
And if they know that you are only there because you owe so much money you can't afford to do anything else, they treat you even worse.
Even worse.
So you haven't necessarily won, even if you get the $170,000 starting job.
Right. However, again, I beg to differ. There's some data just out recently that shows that the people who really get in trouble in not being able to service their loans are people who have about $2,000 in college loans. It's not the people with the giant loans. And the speculation is what it is it's lower income people who sign up for what seems like a vocational, maybe it's going to be a dental hygienist or something like that, and either they can't, because of circumstances, continue with the education, or they find they don't like it, and then they're stuck with these loans. But they're like it's analogous to the law student. They didn't get the job to service the loan.
Still got the debt. Well, is there sort of a class-based thing generally, sort of the treatment of different college majors? I mean, is that one of the things people are getting at when you sort of compare? Like the idea is that like art history or a liberal arts thing is some sort of hoity-toity thing for some pampered child. Whereas if you go into engineering, that's practical. That's almost a blue-collar college degree or something.
Well, I think it's that. It's that some of the richest people in America have engineering degrees. It's also because most of the people who are making this critique are men who think that you should do something, that seems more masculine, and they don't like the idea of people studying literature, which strikes them as feminine, or studying art history or whatever. So there's a lot of things going on. Americans like practical stuff. I mean, the American university system, for the most part, is based on the idea historically of, you go to college to rise economically. That's what the land grant institute colleges are. Yes, we have other types of colleges. There are traditional liberal arts colleges, but another point that I saw somebody making recently was that even the Ivy League schools, with their very traditional, back in the olden times, liberal arts curricula, were designed for people to prepare for the ministry or prepare to be lawyers. They were sort of, it wasn't inquiry for its own sake, it was a sort of vocational thing.
Yeah, and I think the other side of that is when people say engineering, in one sense what they really mean is they think the liberal arts have been dumbed down in a way that they don't think engineering has been. And I think there's actually some truth to that.
And there's some truth to that.
Rigorous liberal arts really teach you a lot, but anybody could go in and spout Marxist Kant for 45 minutes and then give everybody an A- or a B+.
Well, I mean, regardless of the content of the liberal arts course, I think engineering schools still tend to grade on the curve. And so while they've had great inflation, it's harder to have it. You don't have a thing where everybody's getting either A's or B's.
Right.
Whereas there are tremendous pressures on professors to give really good grades. And the more students are paying, the more they want good grades. And so if you can grade really tough in a comp lit course, even in a Marxist Kant course. You can be a hard grader. But, your life will be a living hell if you are that professor who is a hard grader, and especially if you don't have tenure.
So if you were reforming higher education, how would you change things?
Good question. I mean, I think that one thing I would do is I would, if I were, first of all, it depends on who am I reforming higher education. If I'm a university president with a lot of power, which a lot of university presidents actually don't have a lot of power, I would look to do some of the things that have been very unpopular at Princeton, which is fighting grade inflation. The students hate that because they say, the students from Harvard and Yale, the graduate students think that they're actually better students than the Princeton students because the Princeton have tougher grades, which, by the way, compared to when we were in college, which was after the big Vietnam grade inflation, these are not terribly hard grades, but I would toughen up on grade inflation, and you can specify a curve. I mean, you can say, we want such and such. We want at least 10% of your wonderful class of brilliant geniuses to have C's.
Right.
I mean, you can say that. People say that at schools. My husband is a professor. He has been in business schools where that's specified. And I would look very at majors that seem to be drawing the sort of wrong sort of student, and say, to the faculty, you have to make a deal with the faculty. You have to say, you will get your FTEs, you will be able to have your staff, even if you tighten up your standards. I mean, I talked to a friend who's a sociology professor who said, we tightened up and we lost students, and we loosened up again because it's a market,
What so many people don't realize is how much of what goes on in a university in terms of required courses and budgets and everything is really driven by the need to put bodies in the seats. It's not so highfalutin. So that's right.
There's a tremendous lot. I mean, you can't talk about higher education really without knowing the institutions involved, and those are different from school to school. If you're trying to improve a small liberal arts college, that's different from if you're dealing with the University of California system or something like that, or the Cal States, the biggest, the biggest state college system in the country.
Well, exit question. I feel like John McLaughlin. Exit question. So Scott Walker said that the real problem with higher education is professors just aren't working hard enough. And he pointed specifically at the University of Wisconsin, which I don't know that much about in terms of professors' workload. But do you think that's generally a fair critique? Or?
I think that people who make that critique, first of all, tend not to understand the market for professors. You can make them put in more hours, but you will have to pay them more. It's like anything else. And there's a reason that, the people in the humanities have higher teaching loads than the people in the business school, because supply and demand. There are a lot of people competing for those humanities jobs. It's hard to find a finance professor because you're competing with Wall Street.
Yeah, I mean, of course, my take on it too is that if you look at where most of the expense comes in higher education, it's administrators.
That's a really good point. Yes, there's a huge administrative bloat, and even that is not all entirely up to the colleges, because, for example, we've had all this rape hysteria.
Right.
Well, the result of that is like every college in America's got to hire a few more administrators, basically by federal mandate.
And there we are. Well, thanks so much for taking the time to talk with us.
Thank you.
And thanks to you for tuning in. We'll be back soon. In the meantime, have fun on the internet. Thanks.